Good evening, everyone. Hello. What an absolute pleasure it is to see everybody here tonight. Thank you so very much for taking time out of your busy day and night and visiting and joining us here this evening. We have a very exciting and interesting talk tonight. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome you all to Big Little Science Center. I'm Susan Hammond. Previously, you may have known me as the operator, but now I'm very excited. I have retired from that position, and now I get to do the fun stuff, special events. So you'll see me again if you come back for our next talk. Our lecture series is the last Wednesday of every month, except for summer, August, and July. We have some really cool people lined up. I'll mention a bit more about that later. Right now, though, I think we are all here to hear some interesting stories and information about fungi. And the old joke is the fun guy gets to tell it all. Dr. Gary Hunt has been in Kamloops since 1986. A long time learning and exploring this beautiful land. I am absolutely thrilled because I've been here since 1990 and exploring as well. This is a marvelous, interesting, fascinating, ever-changing world that we have around us. We are so very lucky to be on the unceded, long-term territory of the Secwepemc people, and that we are able to share it with them and each other makes a world of difference. It is absolutely in my mind, the best place you get out and explore. You don't have to worry so much about the weather. You've got an ever-changing world with all the 4 seasons. You might need to worry about some ticks and rattlesnakes occasionally just to up the adventure level. But at the same time, we have so many beautiful trails and different habitats to explore. Today, Gary Hunt is going to be talking a little bit about the fire aspect, which is a very important part of the area, and what happens afterwards. I'm going to let him talk a little bit more about himself and get right into the talk. So without further ado, let's give a big warm welcome for Gary Hunt.
Thank you. I'm not going to say a lot about myself. I taught at TRU for 25 years, and the emeritus part up there just means I'm retired, I'm old, but I'm still functional, more or less. Okay, there you go. So we'll leave it at that. So thank you for the land acknowledgement. And before I get started with this, I have a little story that relates to mushrooms and the land acknowledgement and our local native tribes. Before pandemic, back in 2019, I had a chance to talk with Marianne and Ron Ignace from the Skeetchinson Band, and you may remember that they came out with a wonderful book about that time, and they were promoting on the Secwepemc people and our local tribes here. And I asked them how important was collecting and eating mushrooms to our local bands around here. And I was surprised that their answer was not very much. The reason being that in this dry interior environment, mushroom production is very inconsistent. It's not reliable. You don't know what you're going to get from year to year. And so there was nothing about it that was one of their staple foods or anything like that. And especially out Skeetchinson way, where it's really dry, you see. Some years they would have almost nothing at all, you know, kind of like us in the last 2 drought years we've had. The last 2 falls, there's been almost nothing in our dry areas around here. Anyway, there was one really neat, interesting mushroom that was and is still important to our First Nations bands that I want to tell you about. It's a mushroom called lightning mushrooms. And lightning mushrooms are unusual in that they are a large, white, very robust mushroom, very good edible. And the other thing that's unusual about them is that they occur in spring. We don't get many spring large mushrooms. Most of the popular edibles and the ones that are easiest to find come in fall with the fall ring, not spring. So all mushroom species have their timing, their phenology. It's kind of like the flowering plants. We know when the different flowering species come along one after the other. They all have their timing. It's the same thing with the mushroom species. Anyway, to my story. These lightning mushrooms, that the story was that when you see a bolt of lightning hit the ground, sometime after that, it seemed that there were mushrooms that came up in the area of where that lightning had struck. So that was the belief. And so it may sound like, oh, that's just a bunch of fantasy. But then later on, we start looking at the research that's being done with fungal mycelium, that's the main body of the fungus. And if you apply an electrical current to a fungal mycelium, anyway, under laboratory conditions, they can get it to do this. Sometimes that mycelium will start making mushrooms for you. Okay, so maybe it's not all fantasy. Yeah. Now, the only part of that might not fit so well is we don't very often get lightning and spring around here. But who knows? Maybe it's a holdover from the previous fall or something like that. Okay. So interesting story anyway about lightning mushrooms. Okay. So. I didn't bring pictures of lightning mushrooms because they're not fire related, but we had a talk we had a Naturalist Club hike by Frank Ritzie, one of our longtime famous club members, and he took a walk up Lac du Bois Way, and he pointed out to the group that went on the hike with him that these spring lightning mushrooms occur up in Lac du Bois, a bit above above Lac du Bois itself, okay? I have found them there, I photographed them, and they are there. The thing is, they are not consistent year to year. A lot of mushrooms do not occur every year. They love to skip years. They may happen every 3 years, 5 years, once in every 10 years. Okay? But the main part of the fungus, the mycelium that lives underground, is there all the time. But maybe the conditions aren't right for it to produce a mushroom. The mushroom is just the reproductive part of the fungus. It's not the main body of the fungus. So it's very much analogous to the flower on a flowering plant. It's just the reproductive part, okay? And so anyway, you're not going to find these things coming up every spring. About 3 springs ago, they came up very nicely, and I found them up Lac du Bois Way. And a little bit farther north here in the Prince George area, I had some of my First Nations students at TRU tell me that the native bands in the Prince George area just love these lightning mushrooms, and they are much more abundant up there than they are right where we are here. So they're more common to the north, okay? And the other neat thing about them is they are mostly just a Canadian thing. They don't occur in the US. I think they might be reported from just across the border, maybe in Washington. But when I contact my mycologist friends in California and say, do you ever see lightning mushrooms? They say, what the heck is that? Never heard of that one. Okay, so that's kind of cool too.
Similar to the St. George mushroom?
St. George?
Yeah.
I do not know St. George mushroom. Do you know anything else about it?
They're a European mushroom.
Oh.
The lightning mushroom and the St. George mushroom have been found very similar characteristics.
Oh, okay.
Has done a bunch of research on it.
Ah, interesting. Okay, yeah.
One of the big patches down here, Larry Moran actually found it.
Mm-hmm.
And they pick it every spring.
Oh, really?
And it's kind of kept top secret because
Yeah.
you only get about 40, 50 pounds out of that area.
Yeah.
But certain areas, they do come up pretty consistently.
Right, yeah. Okay, very good. Okay, let's get on with it here. Okay, let's start with a little skill testing question here. If you go into a particular geographic area and you document all of the flowering plants, then we say that you have documented the flora of the area. Okay? Go into an area, you document all of the animals, then we say you have documented the fauna. For you go into an area and you document all of the mushrooms, then you have documented the what? Fungi, okay. It's kind of a missing word for most people because the fungal kingdom is kind of, well, the overlooked and not always remembered kingdom. The word I like for it is the mycota, following from mycology, which is the study of the fungi. And so I like to say you document the mycota. However, it wasn't long ago there's been a debate in the literature with mycologists about what do we do with this word. We have flora, fauna, we need something else to fill in that space, right? And the great governing body that sets all the rules for how you name things in fungi debated this, and there were papers published, and guess what they finally ended up with? They decided they like funga. Flora, fauna, funga. Only because those three words kind of sound alike, and they said we want to keep them uniform. I don't like funga. It sounds like some kind of terrible disease. You know, so I'm still going to say mycota because I like that one better. Anyway, mycobiota is another word that's used for that. So much for a little terminology now. Now you know. Everybody talks about, conservation. We have to look after the flora and the fauna. We need to start adding that third word. Don't forget the mushrooms. There are mushrooms that are worthy of conservation. There are rare ones. Anyway, I don't want to get too distracted here. The kingdom of the fungi have not always been a separate kingdom. In fact, through all of my schooling, up through graduate work, that was shortly after the Stone Age ended, all living things were jammed into two kingdoms, plants and animals. And that's all there was. And then in 1969, a guy named R.H. Whitaker came along. And he said, it doesn't make sense to try to jam all of life into two kingdoms because there are huge differences in what we're trying to put together and call them plants and animals. So he came up with a system which really caught on, which is a 5-kingdom system. So he said fungi need to be a separate kingdom because they are so different from everything else. So we have plants, animals, fungi, and then he wanted all the bacteria in another kingdom. Then he said we need protista for a whole bunch of single-celled things. And that 5-kingdom system was really a big deal in the early 70s. And the reason I remember that is in 1969 is when I started teaching high school in California. So when I was teaching my grade 10 biology students, I said, hey, we have a whole new classification system. There aren't 2 kingdoms anymore. There are 5 now. So let's learn about them. So it was a really big deal then. Okay. So I've aged myself, but that's okay. That's the story of the origin of the fungal kingdom and the fact that it is all by itself as a separate kingdom now. So let's look at some of the key features. So this is just a high-level overview of what is a fungus and what are the characteristics of the fungi. Well, their main body is filamentous, and as I said, this part lives underground or in whatever substrate it's eating or getting its food from. So individual microscopic threads of a fungus we call hyphae, collectively all together in a big mass we call mycelium. So that's the main body of the fungus. The mushroom is just the reproductive part. No fungus is green. No fungus photosynthesizes or makes its all food or makes their own food. They are all heterotrophic, and They get their food from other sources. So whereas animals put their food inside them, inside ourselves, and digest things, the fungus grows inside of its food, produces enzymes that break down the food around it, and then takes in the nutrients from outside of its body, you see. So they eat from the outside in, if that makes any sense at all. Okay, another feature of the kingdom fungi that is like animals and not plants is their cell walls contain chitin. Okay, chitin is what insect exoskeletons are made out of, or think of a crab shell or something like that. It's an animal feature, not a plant feature. In fact, when you look at all the features of fungi, there are more of them that are similar to animals than being similar to plants. They reproduce by spores. Okay? And boy, do they ever make spores. The fungal kingdom is a kingdom that is around us and inside of us 24 hours a day. Fungal spores are in the air all the time. We breathe them thanks to our good functional lungs. They look after it. And so most of them don't bother us. There are a few exceptions. Okay? Now you can sample the air and you can look at the fungal spores, and people have estimated that there's something on the order of 200 million tons of fungal spores circulating around in Earth's atmosphere at any one time. So there's lots of fungi in the atmosphere. They're in the International Space Station, they're in all of our satellites and stuff like that. So they're kind of everywhere. They are inside of us because we all know the wonderful things that our gut microorganisms do for us. A lot of those are yeast, okay? So we have a lot of good guy fungal yeast inside of our guts that are helping us out as part of that, okay? Extreme species diversity. Now, when you start to go looking around for how many species there are of anything, whether it's a kingdom, a family, an order, or whatever level you're talking about, things get complicated and messy real quick. The reason is that there's a big difference between the number of species that have been described, published, and accepted as valid species. And then there's the number of species that we think there probably are that are undiscovered yet. That's a really tricky one. It's based on rate of discovery of new species and a whole bunch of other complicated ecosystem things. Then the other big problem with that is there are all kinds of duplicates that confuse these numbers, because many species in all of the kingdoms have been described and named and published more than once, and they turn out to be the same thing. So you have to figure out all these duplicates and try to get rid of those. So I put up some number here from a literature article, which is a good one, but there's going to be numbers that vary all over the place. Now, if you just consider how many species have been named and validly published, way more plants than fungi. Okay? The reason is there are many, many more botanists in the world than there are mycologists. We are a huge minority. There's not nearly as many people working on them, okay? And they're not always nicely distributed across the world like the botanists are, you see. So it gets really complicated, but one thing that everybody agrees on is that there are way more fungi out there than there are plants, okay? Probably at least double, maybe way more than that. And way more animals than either of these, by the way. The animals are up in the millions there. But anyway, just comparing the fungus and the plants, there's way more fungi there. So the other thing we need to know before we get into pretty pictures and get down to the business is here, in order to understand what these fireside mushrooms and fungi are doing out there, you need to understand how fungus gets its food. It gets its food in one of three different ways. The way that we are most familiar with is that they decompose things and break them down, and they are the major decomposers on the planet, okay? The second way that they get their food is that a whole big bunch of them have the ability to kill living cells. Those are the pathogens, okay? And there are a lot of those. So that's a second way that a group of fungi can get their food. Third way is by being symbiotic partners with vascular plants. So these are symbiotic associations, and these species of fungi are called mycorrhizal. Myco referring to the fungus, and rhiza refers to the root. Over 80% of terrestrial plant species have a requirement to get the help of a fungus in order to take up adequate amounts of nutrients and water. Okay? So it's a partnership that has been present ever since land plants were present, like in the Devonian, and we know this from the fossil record. The fungus has been on, these partnership fungus have been along with our terrestrial plants forever, since the beginning. And as I talk about these different mushrooms tonight, I'll be talking about their different nutritional modes, because it's going to make a difference to how they do on these burn sites. Okay, so that's the big overview of how fungi eat and where they get their food from. All right, so the main body of the fungus is the mycelium. If you're a gardener, you will have seen mycelium, because as you're working around in your organic matter, maybe your wood chips and so on, you're going to see white mats of things, although they're not always white. There might be yellow ones, there might be brown ones. But somebody say, yes, I see this white stuff in my garden. It's there, folks, because remember, fungus is everywhere. And the other neat thing about fungal mycelium is it grows under the snow in the winter. So about this time of year, if you go out under your lawn and you see white fuzzy stuff on it, that's fungal mycelium that's been growing under the snow on your lawn, and it's just visible there after the snow melts, you see, okay? So that's the main business of the fungus, is that mycelium. Now, there's a link between climate change. Every talk needs to say something about climate change these days. But because there's fungus in the soil all over the world, if you try to make an estimate of how much there is, it adds up to a whole bunch of carbon storage pool. I mean, a whole bunch. Now, that statement about how much is kind of a weird number to try to even think about, but the idea is this. This plant that depends on this fungus to take up nutrients and water feeds the fungus. It's symbiotic partner. Photosynthesis makes sugars. A lot of that sugar is sent down to the root system and into the fungus, and that's the food source for the fungus. That's all, because these symbiotic fungi cannot be saprophytes. They are dependent on their vascular plant partner, you see. So somebody went to the trouble in this article, a group of authors here, to try to estimate, well, if you consider all that amount of mycelium from these symbiotic or mycorrhizal plants, it adds up to a whole big bunch. And by the way, this does not even include the pathogens and the saprophytes. They were just trying to estimate the symbiotic or the mycorrhizal ones, you see. So it's actually way more than that. Okay, so significant pool of carbon in the soil from fungal mycelium. Okay, so let's get to fire, finally. So I went to the Elephant Hill fire in 2019, and I took a few pictures that I'll be showing you. But of course, the first thing that is obvious is that the ecosystem is utterly and completely transformed when a hot fire goes through. This was a hot fire. So everything about these ecosystems has changed. The living plants have died. A whole bunch of the organic matter is burned off. You have ash, which is hydrophobic and doesn't absorb water well. It repels water. You have a darker surface, which heats up more in the sun. So what happens is, after a fire rolls through, you have a habitat which is completely open and brand new and available for things to come and colonize it. because most of what's there was wiped out in a hot fire. Now I'm going to emphasize hot fire because we know that not all fires are hot everywhere. Some of them are fairly light, so there's a huge big difference in how much organic matter is removed and so on. So there's a whole big range and scale of what the impact is here. You can understand that. But in a hot fire, like we saw on that Elephant Hill fire, oh boy, the organic matter was just roasted right off of the surface. So this is kind of the starting point that all these fungal spores floating around in the air are going to come in there, and they don't have much competition now because everything else is gone. So they're going to get started.
What was the growback time there on the greenery? How long would after?
Oh, I was there later in summer. Yeah, like August of that. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So when we say that the living plants were wiped out, a lot of them would survive as roots or rhizomes or whatever underground parts were not killed. And again, the difference in how hot the fire is makes a big difference in who survives underground and who doesn't. But soil is an excellent insulator for heat. So a lot of things under the soil do survive, and they start popping up. So yeah, green stuff was popping up later that spring and this burn. And of course, because there's a big variation in the landscape, there's going to be wetter areas, there's going to be drier areas. So when you go out and start looking for these mushrooms, and if it's dry later in the summer, you're more likely to find things if you look around the wet areas, okay? And there are also very significant hazards, okay? Because large structural roots that have been burned, they burn deep down into the ground, and they open up these big caverns. And you can injure yourself stepping in one of these if you don't look out where you're going. Now, you might have seen in the news already that some of the big fires from last year can survive over winter under the snow, and they reignite and they start burning again. That's because those large structural roots just smoldered over all winter long under there. The coals are still alive, the snow leaves, they start getting some air, and the fire can come back to life. So there's these pits in the ground all over the place, so you always have to watch out for those. So who comes first? So here we are in spring, and we start seeing the first sight of fungi on the area. And the first thing that appears are teeny tiny little mushrooms that are only a few millimeters across, and they are tiny little cups. Oh, these are thousands of tiny little cups. And they form mats, and they cover a whole bunch of the area, okay? So here's two of them. Let me diverge for just a quick moment to explain the use of common names and scientific names with mushrooms, okay? The vast majority of mushrooms do not have common names. We use the Latin names. The biggest, most famous ones have common names that are used pretty consistently throughout a given geographic area, you see. But the majority of them that are not significant for eating or not very noticeable, they don't have common names. And so as soon as things do have common names, I'll start putting them up here. But these are the genus names for these things, Anthracobia and Pyronema, okay? Another example of that is how common names don't work for mushrooms is that we have this thing called pine mushrooms here in British Columbia, a large, white, very valuable commercial mushroom. You step across the border into Washington State, and anybody from the US know what they call pine mushrooms down there? They call them matsutake, which is the Japanese word for them, okay? So our common names of British Columbia don't even necessarily carry across into US, you see. So common names with mushrooms are a big problem. That's all I'm saying, okay? Okay, so now, before any mushroom appears, the mycelium is well established. So when you see these kinds of mats of these teeny tiny little cups, there's lots of mycelium underground. These little teeny tiny cups don't stay around for very long. They die, they start decomposing. And of course, that means a big input of nutrients into the ash there, and that's going to help subsequent things that come up on the site. So all that mycelium and these first initial ones that show up on the site are going to help prepare the site for what comes after. One of the really neat things that mycelium do in soil is that they aggregate soil particles. They bind the inorganic soil particles together in little globs. And that really helps with aeration, and it really helps with water percolation. So that fungal mycelium is helping to improve the quality of the soil, so it's going to be helpful for the establishment of things that come along later. So lots of little cups up here. Here's Geopixus carbonaria. What an appropriate name, right? Carbonaria. Little cups. Again, just a few millimeters across, maybe a centimeter or so. Here's Scutalinia. This is also called the eyelash fungus, because if you look at the edges of these, some little things like hairs that look like little eyelashes there because they're dark. And there's another little cup. So when you go out on these sites, you're going to see lots of these pretty little cups around at first, okay? Then succession continues, and we start to see other things coming up. So then the morels come around. And so just generally speaking, there are several species of morels. We have 8 different species in BC. Globally, that's what their significance is there. And taxonomically, they come in 2 broad categories, which we call the yellow morels and the black morels. They're just different species, although within each of those, the color actually varies quite a bit. But they have their anatomical differences, and they kind of split out this way pretty well. So they're also called blonde and gray. So that's the 2 general categories. The big majority of the ones that come up on our burn sites are of the black and gray type. Okay? That's the majority of them. So just some pictures from Elephant Hill of what these gray ones look like. These 3 pictures are mine. This one here isn't, but it's still considered one of the gray fire morels, even though it's fairly light in color here. So these happen to be pretty small, but here's what happens, folks. That Elephant Hill fire, it was just crawling with hundreds and hundreds of people and all kinds of buyers out there with their truck. When these morels first emerge from the ash, it takes them a few days to get to full size. Okay? And so when you get hundreds of people out there walking around, they're picking out everything in sight. So all of a sudden, all you have is small ones because people are picking them before they reach their maximum size, you see. So the busier or more people traffic there is on a site, the more likely is all the big ones are they're just gonna, people keep picking them, you see. And pretty soon you end up with little ones. And the little ones aren't worth nearly as much money. I'll get into that part a little bit later. So anyway, they can be big if you get to an area that isn't overpicked, okay? And so that's the situation there. Yeah, I was there kind of late. This area had really been picked over all spring and all summer long. Okay, so let's go morel hunting. This one over here would be like your wildest dreams come true. Forget about it. You're not going to find this. Okay. What you do find is things like this. Okay, so let me see. Oh, where's the morel in here? My gosh, there's dark stuff all over the place. So you have dark mushrooms. By the way, the morel is right there. You have dark mushrooms on a dark ash background. And then you have burned Douglas fir cones. So let me see, where are the morels here? Douglas fir cone. Douglas fir cone, let me see, here's a morel. That's a cone. Morels down here, okay? So my point is, you have to have good eyes, and you have to look carefully, and you have to get an eye for these things, or you just won't see them. There are too many other dark things on the ground after a burn to distract your eye and your attention, and you'll just walk right past a whole bunch of them. Okay, what else do we have? Well, there are lots of other mushrooms that start to come along a little bit later. So you see them concurrently or a little bit later after the Morels peak perhaps. And there's more cups. So lots of pretty cups. There are bright red ones. There are this bright yellow one called the orange peel fungus. And then there are other strange looking characters here, okay? This one here and this one here, these are the genus that we call Gyromitra, okay? This is an interesting one. It's very toxic, okay? This thing makes a toxin called gyromitrin, but in addition to that, they make another thing called hydrazine. Now, if you're a fan of rocket ships, you might recognize hydrazine as a kind of rocket fuel, which it is, okay? And these things are so toxic that if you try to cook them and you breathe the fumes, you will get very sick, okay? So that's what the gyromitras do to you. Yeah, so really, don't even think about eating anything off of these burn sites except your morels, okay? Because you could get into trouble. All right. Yeah, and then we have other neat things like the helvelas. There's a couple of species of those. Weird but attractive caps on them. Okay. Then we have some other neat ones that come up. Now, I think I said on the last slide that they're more generalist. So I'm into some mushrooms here now that are not specific to burn sites. They're generalists. They occur in other sites that are not burned. They are common on burn sites, but they also are fine growing in other areas, okay? So these are amongst these. So we have these verpas here, and some of them can kind of look like a morel, okay? You remember what the morel looked like? It had kind of a honeycomb cap. And you can always tell a verpa because their caps are not attached to the stem at the base. So see how it's loose here and loose over here. So the cap on these just flop back and forth like a bobblehead. And you can wiggle them back and forth. All morel caps are attached firmly to the stem, and they will not wobble back and forth, okay? So you really can't mistake them. Yeah. So really, there's nothing else on these sites that you're going to confuse with a morel. So you don't need to worry about that too much. These morels are distinctive, and it doesn't matter which of those 8 species you come across. They're all good edibles and all that kind of thing, okay? Okay, so here's another fun one. This is a kind of puffball, and some of you are probably familiar with puffballs. And in this case, these Earth stars start development being completely surrounded or encased by outer tissue here, and then that splits apart, and it bends down, and it lifts or elevates the spore sac here up off of the ground. And there's a purpose to that, because what this thing wants to happen is it wants to get rained on. Okay? So the way the spores are dispersed is when raindrops hit this very thin, flexible sac of spores here, then spores poof out of the pore at the top. And I'll bet anything, some of you have come across puffballs and you push them with your finger and you get a big poof of spores, okay? So there's billions of spores inside each one of these, okay? So Earth stars, those are really neat.
Before they open up, are they colored or are they white like more like a puffball?
Yeah, they're white. They start white. Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah. So anyway, that's a puffball.
Never seen them.
Yeah. So this kind of unattractive character over here is called rhizina. Now. In California, where I come from, they call this thing Satan's butt. Actually, it's a little more crude than that, so use your imagination. But being Canadian, we're more polite than that. So we call them pine fire fungus. Okay. Anyway, this Rhizina, it's a pathogen. And this pathogen specializes in killing young seedlings that are trying to establish on a site. Now, Rhizina is not specific to burn sites. So it just turns out that because this is a fire-adapted species, if there's a burn, like a slash burn afterwards, or if there's a control burn where Rhizina is present, all you're doing is you're helping out the pathogen because the spores are stimulated to germinate and start growing with heat. They like heat, they want heat to go around them, you see. So this is a big problem on a lot of sites because where you have Rhizina, it can wipe out a whole bunch of the new seedlings that are trying to establish. So it's a problem with forest management. Here's a really fun one. You're gonna like this one. These are called bird's nest fungi, okay? And here's the structure and how they're built. So what this fungus is trying to do is get rained on again, okay? Kind of like the puffballs. So each one of these things that look like eggs here, okay, is just loaded with spores, okay? Each one of these little packets of spores is attached to a cord which acts like a spring, okay? So the raindrop contacts one of these, so we call this the splash cup outside here. The raindrop impacts on one of these, and it's like pushing down on a spring and then releasing it. This thing flies up in the air. And this cord is also sticky. So if there's any vegetation around, that sticky cord will stick to it. And then you have a packet of spores waiting there to break down and then be window spores. So this reminds me of a tetherball. Are any of you old enough to have played tetherball in school, where you have a volleyball on the end of a cord and you beat it around the pole? Okay. These are like fungal tetherballs, all right? On these strings here, yeah. And of course, after it rains a bit, all you find is the splash cup because all of the eggs are gone and they're somewhere out there releasing their spores, all right? So this is just one of several species of bird's nest fungi, and they're decomposers. So they grow on sticks of wood and they grow on organic matter. They're fairly small, so once again, you have to be looking for these things, but they're really neat when you see them.
So what size are they?
Not more than a centimeter or so. They're small. Yeah. They're tiny little guys.
And they're found in our area.
Oh yes, very common in our area. Yeah, because they're wood decomposers. Yeah, I see them around quite a bit. So they're so fun when you find them. So be on the lookout for those. Anywhere you go, not necessarily a burn site, out on your hikes. In springtime, be on the lookout for any of these pretty cups and these neat little things that are growing on wood. Okay, here's another neat one. Okay. This is called the veiled polypore, cryptoporous, okay? And this has a fun life cycle. Now, ordinarily, when we find cryptoporous, it's on dead and dying Douglas fir. So I wouldn't at all be surprised if some of you have seen these little blobs on Douglas fir trees, right? Well, what's going on here is, you'll see, this is a picture that I took out on Elephant Hill, because obviously the mycelium had survived inside this tree, even though it was burned. So the mycelium pops out this mushroom onto the side of it. You see it has a little pore there, okay? Well, this thing is in a symbiotic relationship with bark beetles. So the bark beetles come along and they can dig, they can eat the hole a little bit bigger. They go inside there, they lay their eggs. The larvae eats the fungus, which is a nice nutritious meal for a bark beetle larvae. They develop into their adults, and the adults fly away all covered with the fungal spores. So the fungus has accomplished its goal of having its spores distributed by insects. Okay? The name here, cryptoporous. Crypto means hidden or secret, and porous means the pores that make the spores. So because it's covered with a membrane or shield at the bottom there, the spores are hidden at first, but then the beetles come and do their work. So that's where the name cryptoporous comes from. Of course, vulvatus just refers to the vulva or a covering in general. So you might be asking the question right now, aren't there any regular looking mushrooms that happen on burn sites? I haven't shown you one yet. It's all these other weird guys, right? Well, yes, there are regular gilled mushrooms that occur, but they don't come along until later. So we've been talking about this sequence of succession that goes along, spring, all during the summer. But later in the summer, we will start seeing some regular mushroom with gills that would look like regular mushrooms to come up here. So we have one called the ash cap, the burn site foliota has brown spores, and then this other one here. So on burn sites, you do find regular looking mushrooms. They just come later in the succession of events. So let's talk more about morels in detail. As a group, they occur in a huge variety of habitats. They will come up in your gardens, in your bark mulch. They come up along roadsides. They come up in your lawns. They can push up your pavement. This particular picture that I took is not a morel, but morels can push through the pavement too. Anyway, if you're wondering, how can a mushroom break through pavement? Oh, the fungal kingdom is so amazing. They generate hydraulic pressure, so it's all about pumping water into the cells as they expand the cap of the mushroom. And it's actually possible to measure the amount of water pressure that they can develop, and it's on the order of 1,000 psi. Okay, so they can push up rocks, they can push up pavement, they can come up between pavers, okay, and stuff like that. So it's pretty amazing stuff. But the point is, you will find them in all kinds of habitats. So start looking around in your lawn and so on. In fact, you can kind of grow them by yourself. And so if you remember way back in 2003, a long, long time ago, a huge fire year, we had a lot of burns around that year. I was teaching at TRU at the time, and I took my students out to a burn site, the Wolf Ranch out by Chase. And we collected a whole bunch of mushrooms. And so you collect a bunch, and then you throw a bunch away because they're too buggy or they're too old or you don't want them. Well, I pitched a bunch of those morels out into our perennial garden that we have at home, which was bark mulch at the time. And guess what? For the next 2, maybe 3 springs, I had a few morels come up. And I wasn't even trying. I just pitched them out there. Okay. So if you have your excess morels, let's say you go out on these burns here in a couple of months. And so if you have ones that you throw out, put them in your bark mulch or some organic matter, and you just might get lucky. And some might end up coming up for you, okay? So you see, the structure of a morel is, it's kind of like all those tiny little cups, but it's all together in one big structure. So each one of these cups produces hundreds of thousands of spores. So it's kind of like a whole bunch of those little cup fungi that are together in one head or cap. and that's what makes up the morel. And, distinguishing the different species, they have these vertical ridges, and then they have some crossbars going on and stuff like that. That actually makes a difference as to what exact species it is. But as I said, you don't need to worry about any of those details because a morel is a morel, okay? So that's a little bit generally about the habitat and where they grow. So now let's talk about what you can do with these things. Okay, so you bring them back and you can eat them. They are considered to be a choice edible, and that's why people are so fanatical about them. Their flavor is really excellent. Their aroma when they're cooking is very good. So one of the things you want to do with all of them is cut them in half. The reason is they are hollow inside, and bugs just love to hang out inside. So I cut this open. There's a bug right there. All right. So these are ones I brought back from the Elephant Hill fire here. Okay. If you have a food dehydrator, that's a perfect way to do it, because the best way to dry mushrooms is just a little bit of heat but moving air. Okay. If you don't have a food dehydrator, put them on a tray like this. Crank up your oven, turn it down as low as it will go, the least amount of heat. Leave the oven door cracked a little bit for some airflow. Then you just leave them in there a few hours until they're all completely crisp and dry and hard. If they're still flexible, there's still moisture in them. And once you get them dry and you put them in a jar and protect them from moisture, they will keep a long, long time, like for years. Kind of like any other dried food, that's going to last a good long time for you. So they store well, they store a long time. Then you can throw them in your stir fries, you can put them in pasta sauces, or however you want to eat. Yeah, sure, put them on a pizza, why not? Yeah.
That's what I do.
I know some of the larger ones are coming out, but the smaller ones, are they cut as well, or are they,
Yeah, no, I cut all of them. Yeah.
some are just faced out?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I did that. So, yeah, like if they've started to decay or anything, you always want to cut them open just to be sure everything's good all the way through. Okay, so to kind of wind things up here, we can ask the question, what is it about burn sites that makes this group of fungi so well adapted to them, and why does all this happen? Well, there hasn't been enough research or science done to really know all the answers as to why this group of fungi really thrive on these sites. I've mentioned a few things already, but we can just put up a list here. Because, as I said, everything about the site changes, right? So you've eliminated competition. There's the death of all the symbiotic plants. Now, for the morels, I had in one of my slides that depending on the species, they can either be saprophytic or mycorrhizal. Now, if they're mycorrhizal, and their host plant dies, then they're out of business. But guess what? Some of them have evolved this genius method of being able to switch from being symbiotic to saprophytic. So that's the ideal evolutionary adaptation, isn't it? If your host partner dies and you want to keep going until another host plant comes along, why not be able to switch your mode of nutrition and start being a saprophyte and decompose dead stuff? That's the perfect adaptation. Yeah, so some of these species aren't just restricted to be only saprophytes or only mycorrhizal. And as more research is done with mushrooms in general, we're finding more and more of them can do the switch hitter mode of nutrition, which makes every sense in the world, doesn't it? To be well adapted. So we mentioned the dark surface area. There's a change in the pH, switches from acid in a regular forest to slightly basic. The chemistry changes, reduction in water infiltration, like I mentioned, and a whole big loss. So this is all we can do with figuring out why they're doing this. We can list how the site is changed by fire, but we really don't know all of their secrets. It just all happens given these conditions, and these mushrooms have adapted to do this for eons. And they take advantage of all these features, and they make a go of their life. Let's talk about the economic situation next. Mushrooms are part of a group of things, plants and fungi that we call non-timber forest products. So within this group, we include things like ferns and moss and salal and anything that's collected from the forest that people want to use for various reasons. These things are unregulated. And by unregulated, I mean the government does not have an interest in being involved with them, in trying to track how much is taken off of Crown land, how much of any of those things, or what the underground economy is like, how big the underground economy is, and so on. So it's impossible to know what the economic impact of all these wild mushrooms are. It's huge. It's in the multiple millions and millions every year. There is no doubt about it. But it's unregulated. Now, the exception to that is that some of our native bands are starting to track some of this. And with the fires and the recent popularity or increased popularity of collecting morels, some of the native bands are putting up signs, and they have a little station. So, for example, Skeetchison on the Elephant Hill Fire, you go out to that site, and on the road they have a little table set up. And if you're just collecting for yourself, then they ask you for $20 to go onto their land to collect. You show up in your pickup truck and you say you're a buyer, they ask you for $500, okay? For any significant buyers at all, that's not a big deal at all, because they're making big bucks. Anyway, to try to get just a little bit of a handle on this, there have been a few research studies done to try to figure out how much money goes on here on these burn sites when people start showing up. By the way, in our area, this is mostly the month of May, so it's easy to remember that May is Morel month. The exception to that is if things heat up real rapidly in April, they will start in April. So it all depends on the temperature, because it takes temperature to get the fungi growing and all the snow melted and things like that. So it could be towards the end of April on our local burn sites around here, more likely to be in May, okay? So let me see, just some of the things that came out of this one literature article. Now, this was a long time ago. It's 2004. Who knows what inflation has done to this? You'd have to go out and talk to pickers and buyers and see what they are getting to get an update on this. But this was a situation in this particular study that was done in the Kootenays. So what you do is you just show up to a buyer. He'll have his sandwich board put out there. It says mushroom buyer. And you say that you're going to go pick and bring some things back. And everything is based on grade and quality. So you head out onto the burn site and you collect stuff. And then you bring them back, and the buyer will put a grade and a price that you get to that. It depends on their size, their condition, and there are lots of different grades of quality, at least a half a dozen of them. And the quality number that buyer gives, what you have collected, depends on how much per kilo that buyer will pay you, okay? Now, we talked about the fact that these things are hard to see, and it takes practice to get good at it. But if you walk fast through the area and you become a really good, efficient picker, and you're lucky enough to be on a site where they're big, beautiful ones, you can make a fair chunk of change, tax-free. thanks to no regulation, and the government's keeping their nose out of this, okay? So that makes it worthwhile for a lot of people, especially if you know what you're doing, right? They estimated in this study that 90,000 kilograms were collected off of this one burn in the Kootenays, but really, we have no idea how many thousands of kilos. I mean, it could easily be 500,000 kilos if you look at all the fires on the province every year. The number's going to be huge and probably unbelievable to any of us how much is actually collected. The other interesting thing was that these authors, in addition to just interviewing buyers and pickers, they set up random plots all throughout this whole burn site, and they calculated how much this burn actually produced in the way of kilograms of morels. And it turns out that this 90,000, that when they added up everything that the collectors took from the pickers, is a tiny fraction of what the site produced, like 1/10 of 1%. The reason is that most people don't like to walk up steep slopes or go very far from the road. And so all the picking is usually restricted to just an area that is most accessible. And then you have to have your buyers close by, that they have to be on a road. And so most of the morels just go unharvested, you see, okay? So don't worry that all of the morels are getting picked, because they're not. We're missing most of them.
How do you pick them? Are you supposed to use a knife to cut them, or?
No. They pull up. Yeah,
Pull them right up?
yeah, they do. Now you do, you don't want to have big blobs of sand or soil on the bottom of them. You can just wipe that off because if you get sand in them, you're not going to get paid much for them, because you have to keep them clean. Yeah, and anyway, in this particular study, after they interviewed the buyers, it turns out the majority ended up being exported out of the country. A lot of others are sold locally or down to Vancouver, sell them to restaurants or stuff like that, okay?
Is it detriment to the sites to be, like if people come in and just wipe out all the morels, is that detrimental to the site?
Well, what's detrimental to the site is the trampling damage to the site, because remember, the main body of the fungus, the mycelium, is living underground. So the more mucking around that's done, the more trampling and compaction, that's what does the damage. But it's not removing the mushroom that damages the fungus. Yeah, like I said, it's kind of like the flower. You clip a flower off, you're not hurting the plant, right? So picking the mushroom does not hurt the mycelium of the fungus, but it's the site trampling and soil disturbance that's the problem. So just to mention, to finish off here, some other important commercial mushrooms besides morels that we have here in BC. Many of you are probably familiar with pine mushrooms, or chanterelles are a huge issue. So all these are huge economically. And I put this other thing here, a lobster mushroom, just because it's so fun and it's so pretty. Because this lobster mushroom, which a lot of people just absolutely love, and they look for this like crazy, and they're kind of easy to see because they're so bright colored. And this is a fungal parasite that is parasitizing a regular mushroom. So here's what the regular mushroom looks like. It's Russula is the name, short stem Russula. So it starts like this. Then the parasitic fungus comes along, attacks that, and you see it completely distorts the gills, turns it orange, and then it becomes a lobster mushroom. But the neat thing about that parasite is, as far as anybody knows, it doesn't parasitize any other mushroom that's a toxic one, okay? Lobster mushrooms are very popular. There are a few other that are commercially important. But these are kind of the big ones, Morels, and these are really make up a big bulk of what's important in British Columbia with these. So I'll just mention in finishing up here that if you are interested in learning more about the kingdom of the fungi, or if you're interested in learning how to identify mushrooms, we have this excellent field guide, The Mushrooms of British Columbia, here. Very good book. It's just a few years old, but the neat thing about it is it's very user-friendly to the beginner, because it really focuses on the common names rather than the scientific names. It doesn't have any keys in it, so you don't have to look at 1A, 2A, which one do you go to, 2A, 2B, and so on. So this is the best field guide that we have now, this new one for our mushrooms in British Columbia. And if you want to look at that, that's perfectly fine. This other book by Sheldrake is just a wonderful grand tour of the kingdom of fungi and everything they do on our planet that's just amazing. So that's a good read too. So, okay, that's it. I'm going to stop there.
Then the next 3 lectures that we are hoping to have in April, somebody from the Canadian Space Agency, whether it be here or by Zoom, that's to be determined. In May, we're going to have somebody from the Invasive Species Council talking about the flora and the fauna, invasive species, and what we can do. I don't know if they'll get into the, what did they call it, fungi? Fungi, that is very ugly kind of a word, isn't it? And then in June, we have somebody coming to talk about native plants and what we can do within our own yards. So landscaping with native species. So I'm really looking forward to what we can hear from that. Share this information with everybody. And again, thank you so much. Help yourself to the food, the drink. Come on up and have conversation with Gary. If Jason's still here, you might want to pick his brain too. Thank you all so very much. Have a great night.